Welcome back to my YouTube, everybody. This week I would like to go through the development of a layout design for the rather small bedroom that you see here. All the dimensions are in inches, so it's a little less than 15 feet by 8. And towards this corner there is a chimney breast which protrudes into the room. There's also 2 windows, although both of the windows can be blocked if necessary, and the door is right in the corner. There's no built-in closets. This is a room in a home in England where a lot of people live in older homes that don't have built-in closets in the bedrooms. Instead, they use freestanding furniture to store their clothes. But when it comes to using it to design a model railroad, the lack of a closet is probably a benefit in most cases. Anyway, although it's a fairly small space, the client is working in N-scale, so it's possible to get a reasonable sized layout in here. He wanted the layout to be set in the 1960s, and he wanted to run fairly long triple-headed mixed freights and coal drags. He wanted a mix of urban and rural areas. He wanted a mix of switching and train running. He was going to be operating most of the time by himself, but wanted to be able to provide jobs for 1 or 2 guests on occasion. He wanted to be able to run fairly long triple-headed mixed freights and coal drags, as well as a few passenger trains. He wanted the curves on the visible portion of the layout to be fairly generous and flowing wherever possible, and he wanted to be able to stage a fair number of trains off-scene, although it was important to him that the staging not be hidden. He was okay with it being on a lower level, provided it was still both visible and accessible, and he only wanted to build 1 scenic deck. And when we started the plan, he wasn't sure whether he wanted a double or a single track main line. We decided to start with a double, knowing that we could shave it down to a single if it didn't work too well. So let's find the first idea sketch that I gave him. Here is the first rough plan. It shows a double track main line wrapping around the room. And as you can see, they don't line up here. The idea is to go around a second time to put staging on a lower level. The client would have preferred to avoid a helix, but we did some calculations and found that a no-lix just wasn't going to be practical in this space. I didn't think it would be, but I needed to try it anyway. And there's just no way that we were going to get sufficient clearance between the staging and the main decks to be able to get fingers in, never mind maintain turnouts. This circle in the corner represents a 16-inch radius curve, because right from the beginning I thought the area behind the chimney breast looked like an inviting place for, if not the helix, at least a reversing loop, because the client felt it was important to be able to run some of his trains continually in the same direction, such as the coal drags, whereas his mixed freights and passenger trains would need to reverse direction for each lap of the layout. So clearly there was a need for a pair of reversing loops. Now the obvious place for the main yard is along the long straight wall, and this plan shows the remainder of the visible space in use with a single track branch line. Now when I sent this off to the customer, he decided that he would much rather have all the action staying on the main line instead of on a branch. And further discussion decided that we were going to scrub the double track main line and go with 2 separate towns on a single track main line. Another thing he wanted me to do is to narrow down the main yard a bit. He thought that 2 feet was wider bench width than he needed, and he would rather have an extra few inches in the aisle if possible. So let's now go to a later drawing that shows these changes. In this drawing we can see that the main yard is in the same location, but the main line has been reduced to a single track. I've used this corner here for a time-wasting loop, which adds running distance between the 2 towns, allowing them to be visually separated with a scenic divider without taking up any more space. And then on this side of the room we have a passing siding, and there'll be some more industries in this area, and the backdrop is moved forward to allow access to the hidden tracks behind it. And we see that I have drawn in my favourite means of minimising the impact of having to cross a doorway, namely a gate that swings horizontally. Now both ends of the main line meet up here. One of them reverses direction so that they can then head down a helix, and although it looks like a double track helix, it's actually 2 concentric single track helixes. There's no connection between them. At this point I wasn't sure how many laps it was going to be. It's all going to depend on how much clearance he wants over the staging yard. And here's what I proposed for his staging area. We see the two helixes come down. Note how they're elongated slightly. That's because with the radius normally used in N scale, the length of one lap is not really sufficient to give a lot of finger room between them. So if one can open it out and add length to each lap of the helix, we can get more finger space between the levels, making it a lot easier to maintain track and re-rail errant trains. If you recall, the last N-scale layout that I did needed a helix, and there was just no room for it then. We were forced to accept minimal spacing between the layers. So now the main line makes a second lap of the room, and we have a pair of reversing loops, allowing for universal routing of trains, either round and round or back and forth. Now the client really liked this plan, and we were talking about what kind of industries to put in. And one thing he had mentioned in his questionnaire was that he wanted a few decent sized industries instead of a large number of tiny industries as seen on many layouts. So we discussed this a bit more, and I broached the idea of having the secondary town over this side of the room developed as a single industry town, and he liked that idea. So we talked about it some more, and the suggestion that he liked was that of a paper mill. And since I've never actually included a paper mill on a professional design before, I wanted to make sure I did a good job of it, so I invested in some reference material, and this is what I drew. This side of the room now duplicates most of the paper making process, although some of it will be represented by buildings that are not actually modelled, but instead just printed on the backdrop. Raw materials start in this corner at the far end of the room, and the paper making process works right to left. We start off with a small yard, allowing the local switcher to store cars and sort them out, because some of the spurs will have multiple spots on them and the cars will need to be sorted into the right order. Then we have 2 tracks for pulpwood delivery, a large pulpwood pile behind it, and as I mentioned earlier, the structures necessary for the first part of the process will just be printed on the backdrop behind it. The next track enters the structure and then heads through the backdrop, and that is the loading track for bark chips, which was sometimes shipped out for fertilizer or mulch. And then we have the chemical area, and for variety I've allowed spurs for liquid in tank cars, bagged chemicals in box cars, and granules in covered hoppers. Clay and kaolin are often delivered either in bagged form or in bulk in covered hoppers, whereas most of the other chemicals would come in tank cars. The next structure here is the power plant with its covered dump shed. This track could have been run along the front of it out in the open, but by heading into a shed it is possible to continue the curve around through the backdrop with a tail track that can take a lot more hoppers than it appears to be able to at first glance. Then we have some specialty mills, and again I've extended the feed tracks for this mill through the backdrop for greater length, and this final structure here is the warehouse for shipping the final products. And then to contrast the one large industry at the back, in front of the track we have a single spur serving a fuel dealer, and this fuel dealer is going to be selling both coal and heating oil. Whereas his coal business would be rapidly declining in the 1960s, his sales of heating oil are increasing, so he's not in danger of going out of business just yet. Now when I sent this design off to the customer, he spent some time looking at it and eventually decided he didn't really like it. He felt it was too built up for his liking. He wanted this side of the room to be more rural in nature. So we decided to abandon the paper mill idea and instead go with half a dozen smaller industries instead. And at this point he actually gave me a list of specific industries to include as well. So let's move on and take a look at the next design. He asked for a cement works, and this one is based around the Walthers Valley Cement kit. He asked for a fertilizer plant, although in this case I've decided that industry is going to be off stage, printed on the backdrop, allowing a nice long lead track, because in many cases on the prototype industries were well off the main line with fairly long spurs to them. And then since the first part of the spur is never going to be clogged with parked freight cars, we can use it to give access to a kickback spur for a smaller industry, and we decided that that would be a good place for a lumber yard. And then the rest of the space along this end we have a fairly large grain elevator. we figured that the grain elevator would be served by its own train, and all the other industries would be taken care of by the same local. Anyway, the customer liked this a lot better and asked for one more industry, which we included back here. We haven't decided what it is yet. It's just some kind of distribution industry. Of course, at this point, we haven't yet started thinking about this side of the room. Although you may have noticed that the passenger station has been removed from the last couple of iterations. That's because we've been talking about that some more, and he's decided that he doesn't want a big station. He just wants basically a flag stop for local trains. So after discussing what to include in the yard, this is what I produced. We decided we were not going to have any dedicated engine facilities, but he was going to have a track where he could park a couple of diesels out of the way, which would be for the local train serving the other town. Because if he's operating by himself, he's going to be running the switcher and the local and the through trains alternately. So he wants to be able to get the extra locomotive that he's not using out of the way on a spur. Now, a yard this size in the diesel age is unlikely to have a dedicated spur specifically for refueling the locomotives. It will be just done on any convenient track from a road tanker. But since by this period many formerly rail-served industries have been pulling up their spurs and going to road traffic, we decided to duplicate that here. I've shown one abandoned spur leading off the front of the layout, and this is another abandoned industrial spur which is now used for refueling locomotives. And we have a few other industries scattered about. The yard itself is only 5 tracks wide, excluding the main. The first track being the main line passing siding, and then we have 3 tracks for sorting cars, 1 for each of the major destinations, and a 4th track as a thoroughfare. And we have a separate short run round at this end of the yard, allowing the switcher to do most of its work without having to foul the main line. Of course, it does have to cross the main every time it needs to switch these 2 industries in this corner, allowing a little bit of interest in what is otherwise a fairly straightforward switching assignment. And generally speaking, he very much liked this plan. He felt the yard was the right size. It was big enough to be able to do what he wanted to, while still leaving plenty of scenery around it so it didn't feel cramped. Although he did ask for a couple more industrial spurs. So let's go to the next plan and show you those. Here I've started to do a lot more work. I've shown more buildings over this side. I've worked out all the grades. I've drawn in the top of the helix accurately. If you remember from before, this track was just cutting across here, just a placeholder. So here I have now filled in all the details, made the plan look pretty. I've adjusted this corner slightly. The curve over the trestle is 30-inch radius. It goes through a curved turnout onto a 60-inch radius curve and then a 120-inch radius before the easement into the straight. So that really should be a beautiful curve around there and a great location for photographing his trains. I filled in all the industries. I put a scrapyard at the front of the layout. I like scrapyards. They can fit into any shaped space. They provide some really cool looking freight car loads, and they're fairly easy to build, requiring no major structures. And they're great for the front of the layout because there's no tall things to reach over and either get in the way or get damaged. Next to that is his rip track. I've already talked about the abandoned tracks leading off the front of the railroad. And then the other industry here, I've left this generic. I'm thinking that the first part of that spur will be used as a team track. At the back, I've got 2 tall industries to add some height to the scene, just as the grain elevator and the cement works do over the other side of the room. We've got an oil dealer in this corner, a less than carload freight house off the main line on this side of the passenger station, and I suggested a second bridge on the swing gate. Now note how on this one spur for the fuel dealer we have a coal trestle at the end on the low-lying ground, then we have oil storage tanks for its heating oil, and then we have a small warehouse for packaged fuels. And I've drawn this extending off the front of the fascia. Not only does it allow us to get a much bigger structure in, but also is a great opportunity to have the front missing and a full interior which is easily viewable. I could have made this industry slightly bigger by using the same technique. I mentioned that in the description to the client, but I just drew it as a full structure. And then one final drawing is the staging level. That has now been fully developed. As I mentioned right at the beginning, he wanted to stage a fair number of trains. This plan calls for 11 tracks running through the front, so enough to store 10 trains while leaving one track free. I've shown how at one or both ends you can add some optional stub-ended tracks so that spare cars and locomotives don't have to tie up through tracks. And then I've shown how there's room for at least one more staging track wrapped around each of the end loops. Now in both cases, these inner loops are slightly below what is otherwise the minimum mainline radius. This one's 15.5 inches, this one 14.5. But the mainline radius on the entire layout otherwise is 16 inches. Now this wasn't quite the end of the road for this plan, because we talked about the length of time that's going to take him to build the helix and the upper deck. And he thought that he might want to be able to run his trains around a continuous loop before he gets that far. So I showed him how an extra cut-off track can be added between the two end loops. This gives us a basic loop free of grades, and once he's finished the main line, it can just become an additional staging track. It is about 8 feet long, plenty long enough for a good length train in Ensco. The other staging tracks range from about 11 to 15 feet in length, so he has scope for some very nice long through trains. So I will just go back to the top deck one more time. Here it is again. And I will leave this with you as I sign off. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you got some useful ideas for your own designs, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.